You know, she sang the song because the lesson title is How Shall We Save Ourselves? And of course I picked it because of the nature of this weekend. Do any of you remember the film Network? I think it was 10 years ago that it came out, and in that movie there was a man who maybe went crazy, you're never sure, but he definitely has something special going on inside of him, and it causes him to dare to open up his mouth. When he finally has the courage to open up his mouth and talk to the world, he gets all involved in his own sense of self. And he lifts up his hands and he tells everybody who's watching on television to go to their windows and open up their windows and to stand in the windows and say, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to put up with it anymore." Did you all see the movie? It was wonderful, and the thing that made it wonderful was that when the people who observed this act became involved in it, when they went out and looked, everybody was out there in the streets with their windows open, raising them up, saying, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to put up with this anymore." It touched something inside of me. Is there anybody here this morning who would like to stand up and say, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to put up with it anymore"? The reason that I think that incident is significant is because rarely do we let ourselves touch that part of ourselves that's sung about in that song, which is the indignant part of ourselves. There is such an eclipse in our society, in our traditional religion, and the eclipse is to close down that part of you that feels your dignity. It's as if we're to walk around slightly repressed, and that becomes, of course, slightly depressed, and with a slight film over ourselves, so that we'll keep everything peaceful and very nice, so that we'll appear considerate and loving and take care of everybody else. Do you know about that one? Are you aware in your daily life, as I am, that you're always coming to terms with that, bumping up against it, having to cope with it, whether it be in your relationships with your children, with your work, with your in-laws, with your mates, whoever? Are you aware of that? Remember, you talk to me, please. Grunt, occasional response. You all know that I lost my father about 6 months ago, and that for the 4 or 5 years prior to that I had told you consistent stories about my mother's experience with my father, and that what I observed happening to her was that he, having had a stroke in 1979, in July of 79, she had increasingly had to take over more and more of the burden of him in her heart, in her solar plexus, and in her mind. It was a slow working thing, and my mother, who is a giver, and whom I pattern myself after, contrary to public opinion. What happened was, because she is so programmed into always giving and always loving and always being up and always being available for everybody else, she watched with horror the gradual depletion of her system as it became more and more worn out, as she increasingly carried the burden of her husband. Last evening she said to me things that I hadn't even known. She said, "Carol, I walked around, we would go out to public, and I'd have to be constantly fearful of what he would do with his urinary system, and she had to be constantly aware of that and watching for him. And she still doesn't understand in her system that what she calls fear was really the strain of too much caring. And I want you to hear this: nobody can carry that on forever without it's finally taking its toll. Do you all know that? You know, have you lived enough and you're getting bright enough and clear enough to get rid of the cloak, the mantle of guilt, so that you can take care of yourself? Now, the reason I shared this with you this morning is because she called me last evening to chat with me, and she was just delightful. I'm going to go spend some time with her this summer so that we can play like we used to play before I left home. And my mother and I always had wonderful times, and we'll probably repeat them. She said, I want to be sure to go to Feline's basement. Now remember, my mother's 82 years old, okay? And this is 6 months after Daddy, 5 months after Dad has died. And she wants to be sure we go to a baseball game, see the Boston Red Sox. And she wants to be sure we go out to Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket and spend a night, which is where our relatives, we're Boston Blue Bloods, you know, where they came from. So we're going to go out and visit the family home. And are you seeing what I'm trying to explain to you? Something's happening to her. Her life is returning, you see, as the burden has been dropped. In other words, the loss of 54 years of marriage can't equal what? The letting go of the strain of her giving her whole self away has given back to her. You would think it would work just the opposite. And my mother isn't avoiding grief. She isn't avoiding pain. She's not cut like that. She's in tune with what's happening within. And then, to my amazement, I want you to realize that my dad was a grower of flowers. In 1958, when he got kicked out of a business he'd been in for 38 years, what he did was he returned to the soil, and he became, he got involved in nursery work, and then he ended up selling Christmas trees and owning finally his own business, a Christmas shop. But the way back for him was through flowers. And my mother always loved that because she'd go out and she'd cut the flowers and put them on the table and got into a lot of fancy decorating. And as she talked to me, she said, I have just made 2 window boxes of plants. And I said, you've what? And I said, how'd you do it? And she said, well, I went out and I bought 18-inch redwood boxes to plant plants in. And I said, did you do that all by yourself? Did Donald and Richard, my brothers, did they help you? She said, no. And she said, I just went down and asked what you do. And I said, did you buy the potting soil and all that? And she said, yeah, I did it all. And she said, the only thing I had trouble with was getting the plants out of the little boxes. And she said, I had to go next door to learn how to do that. And then she says to me, I've never planted a thing in my life. And why did she do it? Because she wants flowers on her kitchen table. What's being said here is that a woman, and sure it's my mother, and you know, I can only tell you stories of my life, a woman who was eaten up, consumed by caring for somebody, has been given back their life and is opening whole new doors for her to expand into. Get the point? Does it apply to you? You know, will you do something about it? Does it click in there so that this morning won't be wasted totally? One of the saddest parts of my life, in case you're interested, we are, is, and I don't know how to get over it except to listen to myself this morning, is that I find that by the end of my week, there isn't much left over for me. Does anybody identify with that? Yeah. Just a few hands, Don't you ever resent that? Don't you ever want to go raise the window and say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to put up with this anymore? Don't you ever feel like you just got stripped, like your family ran through your body? In my case, it's the church ran through my body, and they took everything there was left. And then when I finally got a few days, don't look so dour about this. When you finally got a few days, there was nothing left for you to even get out of bed with. And there you've got the house to clean, the flowers to pull, the weeds, the car, so you have to go to the doctor. Well, that's all for this morning. I have to go back to my notes to see what to say next. Let me see. The next thing, oh, I see. All right. The Bible. I figured it was time for the Bible. Now, you know I have a conviction about this. And my conviction is that we're caught in quite a dilemma. And I think we see the dilemma everywhere. I think it's a little bit caught up in the abortion issue. And it is that you save the mother, you don't save the mother, you save the child, right? Huh? Isn't war a matter of save the nation and kill the son? And have you ever noticed that our armies are usually made of those who don't have good sense enough to say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to do this for anybody? And do you think the government of our country would like to hear me saying this morning? And do you think I'm saying anything political? No. I'm talking to a group of people to get their minds clear about what we do to ourselves, how we get, shall we use the word, set up, in order to convince ourselves to continue giving it away because we don't understand that maybe there is another way to look at this thing. Maybe there are two ways or many ways to look at this thing, but what we're stuck into is only one way to look at it. Do you know that the word self is used twice in terms of something to knit an idea around in the Old Testament, that it isn't until the New Testament that you suddenly open up the Bible to look at the word self? Isn't that interesting? That floored me when I looked up the word self in the concordance. What do you think that says? That says that we're really still living in Old Testament consciousness, where you don't deal with the self, where you don't build the self, where you don't pay attention to the self. Well, what you do is you get the people to become convinced that the way to make the society work, the way to make relationships work, the way to save the kids, to save the world, is to give yourself away. I'm often amazed that Jesus is 2,000 years around and we haven't caught up with him yet. I'm often amazed at that. And I'd like to have you hear a little bit of Jesus just for a minute and take a look at it as a way we might work with ourselves in terms of this. Here's the first one. It's the story of an epileptic boy who is healed. And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to Jesus and kneeling before him said, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples and they could not heal him. Now, when you hear the words could not heal him, I'd like you to think of healing as being, and they did not have the inner authority to speak to him. And I like to talk about self as being that feeling of lack within you that you do not have the authority to speak in your behalf. Can you take healing and magnify it out? How many times do you find yourself sitting, recriminating somebody else because you didn't have enough self to stand up and speak your piece? Ask the question, will you? Come on, ask the question. How many times do you find that 3 days later you begin to hear rattle in your head what you should have said in that important situation? And then you go out and you gossip and tear down the one who didn't give you the authority to speak your piece before them. Do you understand it? What was lacking in the instant? Your authority. How much damning of other people do you suppose happens because we lack self? How much of your life would be cleaned up, do you suppose, if you had enough guts to honor and own you? You know, one of the things I find hardest in life, want to hear another one of my problems? I get sideswiped a lot. I'm going to give a whole lesson on it next week. I think it's called sabotage. I get sideswiped. You know why? Because I generally know my parameters, and I know my limits, and I know what I'll take, and I tell people yes and no right now. And you know what they usually do? They usually blame me because they couldn't get it out fast enough to stand up to me toe-to-toe. You know what they're usually asking me to do? To snuff my life out so that they might live. Do you get that? Do you like it? No. Do you think you'll ever come back? You know what I give people the opportunity to do? To complain and tear me apart until they get it straight, that the reason I'm in their life is to give them enough resistance until they can stand up to me and tell me off too. You know when they'll tell me off? when they feel their own self, when they have their own authority. And you know what's curious about it is that when you finally get your own authority, you don't tell anybody off. You just tell. Feel it? Aren't you glad you came to church this morning? Guys, does it make sense? See how much I can get out of one line of the Bible? Isn't that astounding? Want to see me get more out of another line? Okay. So they come to Jesus and say, your disciples couldn't do anything about it. And I'm saying that's because they don't have a sense of authority. Healing is having a sense of authority. You know, ever since I was 10 years old, I became convinced that I had authority. A part of it came through my prayer life. A part of it became because I was surrounded by people who said, you can have an effect. And I came to believe that. And now I live my life as if it were so. And it is. Curious. It's not curious, it is. Comma, curious. Get it? It's fun to have fewer of you here because I feel more close to you. If I could see it. And Jesus answered, "O faithless and perverse generation." Sometimes he got nasty. "O faithless and perverse generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to be with you?" Wait a minute, I better get up in the line. I mean, this is serious. How am I long to bear with you? I can't read it. I really can't, Mike. I really can't read it. Would somebody give me no? I don't want those things. No, I refuse. I'm a Unity student. My eyes will not go bad on me. Okay, you ready? So, Jesus rebuked him, and the demon came out of him, and the boy was cured instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why couldn't we cast it out?" And Jesus said to them, "Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move hence to yonder place,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible." Feel it? You know, I've already talked about that. There's nothing more that needs to be said. It has to do with, the self has to do with inner authority. And self has to do with faith. And what do you have faith in? Do you have faith in personality? No, that's what the song was about. You have faith in the power that lives within you to carry you, to assert through you, to speak through you, and you find a way to keep bringing that power within so that it will, as I talked about last week, expand you so that you have the consciousness to speak. Notice he doesn't say, he says, you will say, "Move hence to yonder place," and it will move. And we must understand that that's not authority over anything. That is authority into something and through something. Can you feel that? Can you feel that? You. And every time you do that, you are building the self. You are building that little seed within. You are building the kernel within yourself. Now let me go on to another passage. This is Matthew 13. In this one, Jesus gives a group of parables, and the group of parables are provided to explain what the kingdom of heaven is like within. And the kingdom of heaven, as Jesus taught it, is that sense of self that lives within. And he honors that, and he continually asks people to confront that within themselves so that they can build it. And these are the analogies that he gives. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. He goes on, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. And again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net which was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into vessels and threw out the bad. So it will be at the close of the age. Now, this idea of the self is simply saying that one must fill their own inner cup. That what you have to know in life, I guess as you mature, is that what you are, who you are, is a pearl. And what's valuable is to give up everything to pursue the pearl. Now let's talk about what you give up. Is Jesus teaching a philosophy of poverty? I don't think so. I think he made that pretty clear. Is he teaching that you have to leave everybody whom you love in life, all of your friends, in order to gather the pearl? I don't think so. I think Jesus is a much more subtle teacher than that. I think what he's saying is you have to give up all those things, all those parts of yourself, all those conditionings, all those thinkings, all those wantings, all those needings that deprive you of building your own inner self. What are those like? Let me tell you what they're like in my head. When I find myself all run out, this is what I tend to do, and see if you do it. I tend to begin to complain about those in my life who are taking it away from me. Does that sound familiar at all? I begin to feel harassed about the work that I'm in. It takes too much out of me. Do you ever hear yourself doing that? And gradually, if you let this voluminate, then you don't want your job anymore. If I work for civic organizations, I find that the first thing I want to do is drop them all because they ask too much. If I find that I go out and visit the ill, then my complaining starts saying, what am I doing that for when I'm all used up? I hear other subtle things go on inside of my head, like, when's vacation coming? When's my next day off? Oh good, only 3 more days and then I get a rest. Am I all alone up here? I shouldn't say sometimes, but often I get nasty, especially around the house. My dogs almost know when it's Thursday. It's like they see the airline ticket to be sent to Grandma. The parrot knows that the ad goes in the paper that says, parrot for sale. It's the truth. Do you know it? Do you know it? Am I the only one? Those are my signs. You know what I have to give up? Is my avoidance of myself. I'm avoiding me. You know how? By washing it over on everybody else. On washing it on everything else. I will find that old issues reappear, stark-staringly beautiful, at those moments when I am most without myself. You know what I've forgotten? There's a pearl. There's some fish in the sea. There's some value somewhere. And I haven't given it any attention. I gave it all away. So now I blame the takers. And I took. Give is taking. Look at it. Pay attention. So what's Jesus say? He says, give it up. What's that? This is a game of inner awareness. This is a game of inner watching, and it's a fun game. Games are games. All life is a game, so it's a matter of which one you play. So I play the one of inner watching. And I sit around kind of as if I'm in this halo, and I watch the thoughts go pick, 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 pick. Picky, 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 picky thoughts. And every time I watch one go out, once I begin to get aware, once I begin to remember the pearl, I spend my time bringing it back. See that? Bring it back. You know what that means? Bring the energy back home. This morning as I was driving in, I began having a conversation with somebody who hasn't been very nice to me. As I watched it, I went, bring it back. The conversation stopped. I began to value the pearl. If somebody isn't loving me enough, if somebody isn't hanging around me enough, if somebody isn't giving me enough attention, you know what that says? That says I ain't giving me enough attention. That's all it mirrors to me. Psychologically, sure, people ought to pay attention, but spiritually, there's only one person to pay attention to, and that's you, to the self within. And when you learn that lesson, You'll watch the game fuzz itself out, but you won't enjoy it anymore, and you'll know what to do. Bring it back in. And you can do this anywhere. You can do this as you sit behind your desk. You can do this as you carry on a fight, full well knowing what you're doing. Complaining because your husband doesn't give you what you want. Complaining because your wife doesn't give you what you want. As you carry on it, you can remember the pearl. I'm the pearl. Now, society resents people learning this lesson. You know why? Because they're afraid you won't give your money to the poor anymore. You won't give alms to the beggars. They're afraid that Mark won't still be president of the board of this center, that Mike Hess won't bother working in our behalf for land. They're afraid that Charlene won't come over and do the addressograph anymore. They're afraid that the lay ministers won't show up. They're afraid that the mothers who sit at those basketball or baseball or little league games and sell cookies won't do it anymore. Or that you won't be able to get the Mothers Assistance League to assist. Or the fathers, And you know why? And this is the other side of the thing. Because they don't have the finish of the story. I have it. It's never been told in public before. This is a very special morning. It's in the Bible. They didn't read this passage. You ready for it? When you hear it, you'll say, what? So what? I've heard that before. It's this. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. That's dangerous words. I don't think the traditionalist Christians have ever read them. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. How do you like that one, mothers and fathers of the world, and potential mothers and fathers of the world? And he who does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. The cross of self-recognition. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. Now, if that isn't double talk, no wonder we haven't read the Bible. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. That is one of the most curious mysteries of nature that human beings still have to learn that I've ever studied. And the first way it came to me was through reading Chardin. I'm kind of returning to Chardin because he has such good scientific support for the spiritual process. Chardin says a peculiar thing. He says that the point of growth that occurs in the cell, where it is ready to split into two, is a point of supersaturation. At that point of supersaturation, what happens is that one little molecule wandering along bumps into the state of supersaturation, and when he bumps into it, recognizes that nothing can be done until it goes and builds itself up. That's what's being asked for when you build yourself. That you have the courage, when you bump into impossibility, when you bump into your own weakness, when you bump into your own needs, that you recognize nothing can be done until I go and fill myself up. It happens in nature. This is the finishing for the human being. Have the courage when empty. Have the courage when picking. Have the courage when lacking. Have the courage when needing. To, in that moment, when it would look as if you would need more from the external, to seek the internal. Not till you find yourself, can you lose yourself. Now watch this. When that little molecule goes away, it spends time alone. It nurtures itself. I don't care whether it's married or not. I don't care whether it has children or not. I don't care if it has a big job or not. I don't care if it's running a large church or not. It goes away and it fills itself. It finds itself. Do you know what happens to it? Once it fills itself up in nature, its propensity is always to return to the cell. where it pushes itself into that which is already supersaturated, and because it now has the strength, the cell has the capacity to split to become two. Feel that? That's you, that's me. Look at the caterpillar becoming the chrysalis. What does it do? The caterpillar gets to know itself enough so that it can go ahead and suspend itself in the chrysalis state where it loses itself, so that it can return to become a butterfly to give back. Always. The universe is a cycle. It's not an ending place. Think of the seed pod. The seed pod has a shell around it. What's it doing? It's filling itself up. When it gains the strength, when it has enough of itself to protrude through, what happens? Nature, through its own support system, provides it with the strength so that what happens? The shell is cracked so that it can push through to create the next growth. That's you. No self can be given when it's weak. No self can serve the universe when it's coming from lack or need. You're a self. That moment when you want to lift up the window and say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to put up with it anymore, that's a moment of dignity that says, I'm dried up. I need more of me. I need to pay attention to the pearl. And the guarantee built in, contrary to public opinion, the guarantee that's there, that allows you to have the courage to look like a fool in society's eyes, is because you know a law of nature that says, as you fill the inner strengthens. So then it can lose itself and return to give again. What to say?